Hello, everybody. This is the Pacific War channel where I cover the entire history of the Asia-Pacific War and all the major events that led up to it. I'm joined here yet again by Brad St.Croix. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me back on. I really appreciate it and excited to talk about Canada and the war in the Pacific.
Yeah, being fellow Canadians, and I have to admit, a big reason why I wanted to bring you back is I am totally guilty of not really looking into it ever. Exactly what was the Canadian experience during the Pacific War?
So the Canadian experience during the Pacific War is straight out very limited. That has to be said, I think, right off the beginning, because obviously the attention was focused on Europe, right?
Of course.
As Canada often still does, still looks east instead of west in a lot of ways. That really hasn't changed in the last, whatever it is now, almost 80 years. So that's one thing to just think about at the beginning. One thing I did want to start though with, which I always thought was really, really interesting, and this is even pre-war, so this is in the 30s mostly, kind of in the interwar period, is actually most of the defensive thinking, is probably the best way to put it, thinking and actual money and coastal guns, all that stuff was actually on the West Coast.
Yeah.
There was concerns of what Japan was going to do. They were concerned Japan might act on its own, go after the United States, and the Canadian government didn't really think they could sit out. So they had to kind of prepare for that. The thinking was that if a conflict were to, say, break out in the Pacific, and then that's followed by one in Europe, caused by Nazi Germany or something like that, the Royal Navy could step in and kind of really take care of the East Coast. Of course, as we know, things flipped, right? There's the war in Europe is first, involving Canada. So that really changes the thinking. And I think after that, really, the Pacific obviously takes a back seat because Canada's involved in the war in Europe for much longer.
Hey everyone, I just wanted to let you know I now have a Patreon account found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there you can find exclusive Patreon episodes and podcasts based on suggestions from patrons, and other benefits like early access to all of my content, live hangouts, your name in the end credits, and much, much more. So please go check it out.
And much earlier than they are in the Pacific, right? They don't come along until the rest of the Western powers do as well. So it's a limited kind of view, and that's very much on purpose. We've talked obviously previously about the Battle of Hong Kong, the first and largest really contribution of the Canadian Army, but even in the Canadian military, generally speaking, it's a full out two battalions plus a brigade group for an HQ, all of that stuff. So it's just under 2,000 Canadian soldiers are involved, and two nursing sisters are involved in the battle. So that lasts from the 8th to Christmas Day of 1941. And again, check out the last talk we did, where I covered a good chunk of that. But
yeah, I'll just let the audience know, because it's actually not on my personal channel. It's on my personal podcast, but if anyone is interested, you can find it at the Kings and Generals podcast. But you know what? I'll probably re-upload it as a video soon on this YouTube channel, because it was an excellent conversation, really in depth into everything about Hong Kong and after the Battle of Hong Kong, because a lot of people forget about that.
Yeah, I mean, we can probably talk about that as we move along, talk about some other topics, because they are intertwined, as these things tend to be, as history tends to go, as I'm sure a lot of you and your listeners are very much aware of. Anyway, yeah, so Hong Kong's really the first involvement. I mean, we talked about why all that happens. I don't want to get too much in that again. There's kind of a concern within the Canadian public and in the opposition in the Canadian House of Commons that Canada hasn't done enough in the war in Europe at that point. By the summer of 1941, Canadian forces and the Army hadn't really fought. Obviously, the Air Force and the Navy are very heavily involved and had been since day one, but the Army had been seen to be sitting around. I can't see if I'm doing the air quotes, sitting around, obviously, because Dieppe hasn't happened yet. So there's a lot of concern of we got to do something. So that's where Hong Kong kind of comes into play. It was a low political risk for Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, longest name for prime minister I think we've ever had.
Yeah.
It was a low political risk for him because he wanted to be seen helping Britain, and that was helping Britain by helping defend a colony, but also at home, kind of avoiding that domestic opposition, basically, to anything that might lead to overseas conscription, which is a massive issue for him. He may have overblown it in certain cases, but I do think, whatever you think of him, I do think he masterfully handled conscription. It was a very slow burn. And anyway, that we can come back to that again because it kind of connects a little bit to some stuff that takes place at the end of the war that we can move on to. But yeah, so that's how I really like to set the scene with Hong Kong. It's not just some sort of, Britain telling Canada what to do, or Canada, sending their troops to die for no reason, because that's not what happens. The risks are understood, not as well as they could have been, but they are understood. And it's got more to it than just sort of an imperial relationship. And as we know, the battle goes very poorly. I mean, the Canadians hold their own, I argue, in best they can in the circumstances. I feel like with Hong Kong, we project backwards, particularly we project forwards on previous events, if that makes sense. Because in Canada, right, we really focus on Northwest Europe and Italy, which 43, 44. We're projecting those standards on a much earlier time period where Canadians hadn't been in the fight at all yet. So and there's all kinds of issues with equipment and all that kind of stuff that goes along with it. So it's a big issue.
It is interesting that you bring up the issues of equipment. I'll probably try and bring it up later, but in joint operations with the Americans, often the Canadians would end up having to adopt American equipment, the organization of their military structure too, in some cases. It's pretty interesting. Yeah. And we can get to that and kind of why that is in a couple of cases. But Hong Kong, again, because it's early, like in terms of the very beginning.
It's the beginning for the Pacific, obviously, for the Western powers, right? I mean, China, as you cover greatly and very well done, is involved for a very long time, but the Western powers are not really. So again, we discussed that last time, so I don't want to take too much more time in that. But again, the colony falls along with colony after colony after colony at that point, right? Philippines, all the way through, right, to Singapore, Indonesia, Dutch East Indies at the time, and all the way basically to the gateway of Australia until things sort of turn around, Coral Sea and Midway and all of that stuff.
Yeah, they scared the Australians with the raid on Darwin, but
yes,
as much as the IGA talked about an invasion of Australia, it was never a feasible thing. Logistically, it was insane. So
yeah, and I mean that's going to kind of come up again. Obviously, I mean logistics in the Pacific War, I think, are understudied by everybody.
Yes.
It's just massive distance. Even today, like I just look at the Pacific. When you're flying somewhere and you're just Hawaii is said to be halfway, and I'm like, it's not even close to halfway across. Like, it's not even close. It's just massive today. So imagine at this time when you're trying to move armies, it's extremely difficult. So I think that's important to remember, and that's going to kind of come up again because the next one you want to discuss is connected to sort of, and that's what we can kind of talk about, but is connected to Midway and kind of that second round of second round of offensives, I guess you can call it.
Yeah, I like to call it. It's kind of, I mean, the Japanese are changing their posture because of the Midway disaster. They're not necessarily, they haven't lost the initiative yet because that comes after Guadalcanal, but they've definitely taken a big bloody nose. But ironically, the decision to add the Aleutian Islands campaign is a big reason why the Midway operation failed. It was a terrible, terrible fault on, honestly, Yamamoto should have fought harder to not have the others demand such things. I mean, the Imperial Japanese Army also demanded they physically invade Midway Atoll, and by any measure, no matter how the battle went, every single one of those Japanese, if they tried to land, would have been mowed down. It would have been a disaster.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting topic to look at in terms of the Japanese perspective, because again, as a lot of people are aware, there's that tension from the beginning, even when they kind of basically took over the Japanese government, between the army and the navy. They don't get along ever.
You know,
even up to the end, they're not getting along, and
there
it's just so fascinating.
there's a few stories of predominant commanders who do get along and have joint operations. It happens in the Northern Solomons for a brief period of time. It's
Right.
General Imamura and is it Kusaka? I think it's Admiral Kusaka, and they have a little bit of a friendship. They actually force their men to eat at the same table and talk.
Really, I didn't know
Which
that.
is so funny to hear about. But yeah, to get back to the Aleutian Islands campaign, I just
Yeah.
wanted to add in. It's a little minor event that is kind of insignificant, but I thought it was kind of cute to mention because I did have to write a special episode for Kings and Generals about bombardments on the western coast of the
Yes.
United States, and there
Yeah.
was a place in Canada that was technically attacked.
Technically, yeah. So, yeah, just as a quick aside, it's the lighthouse.
Yeah.
Technically, we're saying technically, I'm saying that very loosely. They
Yes.
miss. They don't even hit it.
Yeah.
They fire a couple of rounds. I'm not even sure how many. I
That's
don't even think they even
30 5.5-inch shells.
they don't even hit anything. I mean, they hit the ground technically.
They scared the guy at the lighthouse, certainly.
Yeah, didn't even come close to the lighthouse, which I think is just fascinating. Just because I guess to kind of because they can. It's an interesting one. And they never come back. Because again, we talked about the distances are massive.
Ironically, it did have kind of an effect, but like you mentioned, 1930s, they did raise the defenses and the batteries on the western coast.
Oh, yeah.
But for Mackenzie, it's an interesting because I wanted to look into this. I was really digging into anything I could find for some notes, and I found out in 1995, CBC put out a Fifth Estate report that was trying to perpetuate evidence that they thought it might have been a false flag operation.
No.
And that it was to increase support, apparently, for Prime Minister Mackenzie's wartime policy. So the conscription thing, which is ludicrous because we actually know that it was the I-26. I actually know who was on that submarine.
We know the whole story. I mean,
it's completely cooperated now. But
that doesn't even make any sense of why King would do that.
1995, and they came up with this with what I don't know what evidence, because this was a small article I found, but I thought that was kind of funny.
It doesn't. I'm sure it's made up of nothing. They probably misunderstood what King was saying, like something in his diary. I mean, that diary is pretty thick. If you don't, I mean, it's a great resource, but if you don't understand how King wrote, you can get very confused very quickly. And it took me a long time because he's a terrible writer. Because this is a quick aside, but I've always, I was looking at stuff for VE Day actually, and you always hear about these speeches and all these things, and I'm like, and you listen to King's speeches and you're like, yeah, I can see why we don't have these as a kind of use, because they're just terrible. He just kind of rambles on and he speaks almost like Yoda in a backwards kind of way. And it's just, anyway. So yeah, I don't really, a false flag, that makes literally zero sense.
No, it was one of the weirdest things I had to find in all of this time when I was looking for any tidbit information. I was even looking for Canadians were involved in the Burma campaign lightly. There were officers who were assigned to certain groups. But to get back to the Aleutian Islands, I guess maybe I'll just tell the audience, because a lot of people really don't even know about this. So everyone who's watching this probably knows a little bit about Midway. There's been so many movies. It's honestly, it's kind of the most popular battle of the Pacific War. Part of the Midway operation was a invasion of what we call the Aleutian Islands. The two most important ones, although there are many others, was Attu and Kiska. So the Japanese took these, they were occupied by Americans kind of loosely at the beginning. They pushed aside the Americans. I mean, literally on Kiska, I think it was just a handful of people who were stationing something.
Yeah, Kiska was Kiska's got a lot of, and we can get into this, but a lot of misunderstandings surrounding just Kiska itself. I don't know as much about Attu, but I know at Kiska there is no military presence at all. I've heard it was an uninhabited island, which is not true. There was indigenous people still living on.
Oh, yes, of course.
They don't live there now. I mean, and if anyone's ever seen any videos of this place, it makes perfect sense why humans don't live there. This place is just inhospitable as a definition. Anyway, we can get to that in a second. But yeah, it's part of the Midway campaign. And another thing with the myths, right, is it's part of the campaign. And we alluded to that disagreements, it's putting it very mildly, about what to do with Midway and how to go about it. The army wants to, do what armies do, and occupy. So they do that. But one of the things that I often see, and maybe not in your audience, I'm sure they know, but people seem to think that, the Aleutians were occupied first. They weren't. Midway happens first. So they mess up their own plan. It doesn't quite work how they want it to go. And I think that's just kind of going back to what we were talking about before, just this lack of coordination. And I think they are losing steam even before that, because they're making decisions that don't quite make any sense.
I mean, it's getting a little bit dated now, but the greatest, well, I think there are better books now, but the greatest book back in the day was Shattered Sword for Midway. It really looks at it precisely minute by minute. And, you know, they'll break it down to like the way that they describe it. Yamamoto was particularly bad with this, overcomplicating plans.
Yes.
Too many different units, too many different timetables, too much variables open. And I mean, when they put Nagumo in charge of all this, he was a guy that was by the books. He'll do exactly what you say, but he is not open-minded to what to do if something changes.
Yeah.
Great kind of guy to have, because you know exactly what he will do. But when Yamamoto was determined that there was no chance the codes were broken or that the American carriers might just show up on them, well, we all know what happened. But for the Aleutian Islands, which was really a secondary thing off to its own, the Japanese have now landed on what's technically called American soil.
Technically, it's a U.S. Alaska at the time is a U.S. territory, just like Hawaii. So it's not a state, but it is somewhat different than a colony. Again, I'm not really sure what the actual differences are. I don't think there is any difference.
I don't know if they
know. Nobody knows. Nobody still knows. Anyway, so it is technical U.S. soil, so it's the only one that's held by the enemy for any extended period of time. And like I said, you have Attu, which is just a completely brutal battle.
People don't know. I have to give it to I know, because I didn't write the episodes, but I edited them. Kings and Generals did quite a few episodes, because it's a week by week format for the Attu battle, and I myself was ignorant as to how unbelievably terrible Attu was. It was insane how bloody and how many people were suffering because of the conditions, because the United States Army was issued leather boots at the beginning. Not good.
It's really bad. I mean, it's just determined Japanese resistance, which you're going to see time and time again. It's like very much a precursor to things like Okinawa. So Attu is a brutal fight. There's not really any Canadian involvement, Army involvement.
No.
There's a little bit of the Air Force is involved. So the RCAF, and I'll state this now, is involved throughout the Pacific. That does happen. That happens from even before the official outbreak of war right through to the end. I mean, the last Victoria Cross is actually, well, not, it's a Navy, but it's a Navy aviation, which in this country now is one and the same. It's mixed together now, so this is why I cover it this way. But it's a Canadian, right? So it's we can get to that later. But it's something I do want to say off the top is the RCAF is involved, or RCAF personnel, and the Navy as well. The Royal Canadian Navy is involved in small pieces, particularly along the coast. But there's a much more interesting story that we'll get to later. Some of your audience knows where we're going with that one.
I'm interested in that one. I've kept myself very ignorant of that story, by the way, because I wanted to let you tell it, because it's when you mentioned a little bit of it, and it sounds so crazy. But anyway, it's not a complicated story, but it's just so strange. There's the little teaser. So moving forward into Kiska, right? Because Kiska doesn't really have any U.S. defenses. There's not an outpost, nothing like that. There's concerns over it being an air base, but when you look at Kiska, you're like, not possible, not easily possible. The place is very rounded hills, and it looks like something out of like the Lost World from an H.G. Wells novel or something. It's just otherworldly, as I like to say about Kiska. But anyway, so there's a bombardment of Kiska for an extremely long period of time. Hitting the positions, anything they can see, which is hard, because the fog coverage of it does not allow aerial bombardment to and when the planes can even make it, I mean, a lot of planes are lost just trying to say
there's high loss rates for the small amount that it is. And on a good day it's still foggy, it's cloudy, very difficult. The ships sometimes can't even get close because they can't see. Air crews get lost all the time, or they think they're over Kiska and they're not. And again, maybe we can talk about that now, but the outright intelligence failure, I mean, luckily it doesn't really have any impact technically, for any, very small loss of life, but we'll get there. But that huge allied intelligence failure to say
just to catch the audience up, before we get to what is the retaking of Kiska, for an early half of the Pacific War, there's kind of a whole separate command going on in Alaska, and they don't.
Yes.
I mean, they have basically all the hand-me-down ships. They have the worst of the worst. Even their Air Force units at the beginning are pretty rough. So they're building up, but once they start to build up, they start taking smaller and smaller islands, getting closer and closer to what is Attu and Kiska.
Yeah.
But what was kind of interesting is at the last minute they decide to attack Attu first.
Yes. Correct.
As a deception, and they also raise an enormous blockade, and they force a few naval battles against the Japanese, which utterly hurts the northern Pacific force for the Japanese. Like they know they're at a point where they just can't contest the blockade, and that's what really starts the operation to invade Attu. Now Attu's further than Kiska, so by taking Attu, you've actually completely isolated Kiska. So it was almost like a 2-for-1 in a lot of ways, because they knew if they could take Attu, what's the enemy going to do with Kiska? They're going to freak out and try to evacuate, which is what they do end up doing. And what he will bring up now is the Allied intelligence as to how that goes about with the evacuation.
Yeah, so the evacuation, I don't know too much from the Japanese perspective. I mean, it's seemingly very orderly.
It was a miracle.
Yeah, I mean,
they
pretty
broke
much
through the blockade somehow.
to get through that block. Well, that's what I mean. We're talking about that with the ships, right? And the planes and the crews can't see. This is how they slip out. I mean,
it was literally described in one book as one of the worst fogs that they had seen, and they went right through it.
Yeah, you can't see anything. I mean, there's video from Kiska. It's incredible of what you can see or can't. I guess is the best way to put it. But yeah, the ability to get out and in full order is just mind-boggling in and of its sense. I mean, you got a little bit of luck on your side, as these things tend to happen in military history. There's always a little element of luck, but when to know when to move through is using destroyers to get those troops out is just, it's just for all kinds of reasons. Because again, like I said earlier, the sea around these islands isn't exactly the calm, easy.
They lost a lot of ships on Pinnacle Rocks and all sorts of things, especially when they were unloading troops at Attu. There was a transport, no, it was a destroyer that got wedged right against the rock, and they almost lost the ship. They lost so many aircraft too during Attu. But yeah,
it's just, again, I can't really, because I typically work with video, right? So it's without that visual, it's hard to really push forward how, like, anyway, you can see this in other places. It's just it's mind-boggling. But yeah, so the Japanese getting out is one of their best withdrawals.
Yeah, I think
not many of them. So
yeah, Guadalcanal was a miracle story of how they got out of there, and Kiska is definitely a miracle story.
It's got to be those got to be the top two. I mean, there's not many to pick from on that level anyway. So yeah, it's amazing that they pulled this off, and all without the Allies knowing anything. Nothing. They knew nothing. And why we know that is because all kinds of factors. The Navy, like we said, couldn't even get that close because they couldn't see. So they couldn't get close until this sort of fog dissipates. And even then, that doesn't really give any tips to what's going on. Again, planes can't fly when they can't see so much back in those times, right? You're not flying by instruments too much, or you don't really shouldn't be, and particularly in those conditions, and that far from bases, because again, the distances are still massive. The Aleutians chain is massive,
very, very long,
very long. So it adds to that. But another thing, and I thought is so interesting, and how these things go, and being a historian and working with memory and all this stuff, is pilots, after we have the records, know that the Japanese were gone, claim to be getting shot at. And they can't explain it. It's still unexplained all this time later. That coming up, actually 80 years is coming up, and it's not explained. They don't know. Could it have been anything? Could it have just been explosions on the island from time, demolitions? We don't know. But I think it's just so interesting is that these pilots report being shot at, so that the island is occupied. So this is what leads to what I, quote unquote, call the Battle of Kiska, or the battle that never happens, because in the terms of things, yes, it's small, and I understand that, but from the Canadian context, it had the potential to be massive.
Big. Yeah,
for all kinds of reasons. We talked about how Attu, right, was a bloodbath. That's what Kiska was expected to be.
Oh, because of Attu, they had made a lot of changes, and that's honestly why the Canadians forwarded such units and a special operational unit too
Yeah,
on
exactly.
top of it.
Yeah, because this was supposed to be the first, again, battle of the first Special Service Force.
Yeah.
Right, the combined American Canadian unit with their highly specialized training in all kinds of areas, parachutes and
The parachute. The first, is it the first parachute battalion or is it the second parachute battalion?
I'm not sure. No, remember.
Yeah.
Anyway, but that was supposed to be their first, test of battle. That was the idea, is that they would learn here, which again, obviously doesn't happen, and they leave fairly quickly because there's no point in having them sit around. But yeah, so that's the idea. They're going to throw a lot of forces at Kiska, like you said, to learn from what happened at Attu, try to stagger the landings in two different portions of the island, because it's a bit of an oblong but very skinny kind of island. So it's best to cover it from two different perspectives.
Yeah, for
and
the
there's
audience,
limited landing beaches.
Yeah, for the audience, the Canadians, the Americans are literally landing on what you would say is like two separate sides of the island.
Pretty
So
much.
it's pretty simplistic battle plan, I guess, is to just converge. Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of the idea.
Yeah.
Is keep it simple for that, because also there's not much you can do. There's hardly any landing beaches. Like, they barely exist on this place. Like, it's literally high cliffs, and there are beaches, but it's almost kind of like in Gallipoli. Like, there's a beach.
Yeah.
But there's not much else right after that. It's just cliffs and high mountains. There's just not much area to move around. So they only are limited by their choices. And that was kind of the thinking, is we'll stay away from the quote unquote best beach that the Japanese had, as they could tell, as close as they could tell, was highly defended. But as it turns out, they land and there's nobody there.
But they don't know that.
They think there are Japanese there. They think they're there when they come ashore, because the Americans land first on their beach. They think they're there. They think they're getting shot at. They weren't. Again, it's not blaming them. I'm not judging them. It's just adrenaline battle, fog of war, literally fog also. It's so much going on, and it takes some time to realize what's happening, because you just don't expect that coming into this fog-covered, damp, windy island that you've never been to, that the enemy has been in for quite some time now, that they've dug into, and they knew they dug into, because especially afterwards.
To give the audience just kind of an idea of what's going through these guys' heads. So basically 28 Japanese were captured on Attu, and I think it's like 28,000 men die. A lot by suicide, mind you, at the last hurrah. They do a last banzai charge with their captain with his sword going. It's an incredible story.
Yeah.
And they even raised a monument to it. They were so impressed by it. It's very rare that the Americans would do this for the Japanese.
Yeah.
But so they're coming right off of this extremely bloody campaign.
Mm-hmm.
When they get on the Kiska, like the weather is bad, the fog is there, they can't see anything. The Japanese are not there, but the Japanese have left booby traps, which is something they like to do. There's also some mines in the water, and there was a ship, I think I had wrote somewhere in the notes, the USS Abner had hit a mine, killed 71 guys and wounded 47. So, the blood's hot for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, it's expected to be a very tough fight right from the get-go. Yeah. Because the topography of that island favors the defender in every way imaginable. And again, like I said, the Japanese had time, which is, as I'm sure a lot of the listeners know, is a key element, especially in this place. You can dig in very well.
And for this kid, for most of these men, some of them, yes, they have been. Like, a lot of these guys have been trained in the Aleutian Islands, but they're coming across still unknown territory, and the booby traps, some of them are timed explosives.
Exactly.
And they, from what I've heard from reading some primary sources from some guys, like, it did sound like bullets. So a lot of them say they thought they heard bullets.
Yeah. So as far as I can tell, it's difficult, because I haven't accessed any Japanese records, but they think they rigged small ammo dumps to blow for that exact reason, to sound like it, to throw them off.
Certainly worked.
And it certainly worked. I mean, they are firing on each other. The Americans fire on each other multiple times.
Oh, yeah.
Until they figure out what's going on, because they're coming in contact with each other very quickly. That wasn't supposed to happen, right? That's not how that typically goes when you have an amphibious landing that's opposed.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how they figure it out. So the Canadians are still not involved yet. They're going in the next day. So that's another myth. I mean, that's what I like to focus on because that's what kind of my academic background was. But this one is just full of so many myths. I don't know what is with Canada and the Pacific and just chalking myths everywhere. Another one is that the Canadians and the Americans fired on each other. Not true. That never happened.
Oh, there is a very famous YouTuber who made a big video on this.
Yeah, I'm very much aware of who that is. And that video is completely false. Never happened.
Clickbait. Yeah.
It's very clickbaity and it's not accurate whatsoever. I mean, watching that video was painful because it's just inaccurate, not even close to at all what happens. They don't come in contact with each other because by the time the Canadians get on the ground, they still think there might be on that chunk of the island because they can only move so quickly. Yeah. Then they quickly realize there's nobody here. So that's how it happens very quickly. So the battle basically comes to an end. Can't even call it a battle. There are still casualties. There are a high number of casualties.
For the Americans.
For the Americans, have a huge number of casualties for what they're facing, which is just booby traps and ammo and things like that. The Canadians take casualties as well. There's 4 killed. That's kind of where the myth comes in a little bit. Yeah. It's claimed that they're killed in this firefight that never happened.
Do you know what killed? Was it? I would assume it was booby traps that killed.
Booby traps. So as far as I know, 4 killed. Yeah. So I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it was 3 were booby traps, at least 2. You know how setting up looked like a prize flag, whatever. And one just mishandled a shell or something that he probably shouldn't have been touching in the first place.
Yeah, of course.
And that happens all the time. I mean, it still happens to this day. And it killed him. So that's where they come from. That's where the casualties come from in terms of the losses, the deaths. There are other casualties technically under the definition, even in the Canadian Army, of wounds and injuries, because that's where I think this story gets very interesting, is because, like I mentioned with the first Special Service Force, they're only there for a brief time. Canadians who go to Kiska are there for a long time. They just kind of leave them there.
I've never heard this, actually. I didn't know.
Yeah, they just kind of leave them there. They're there for a very long time because this is in August of 1943.
Yeah.
This is balmy summer weather in the Aleutians. They're just kind of there to sort of prep it in some sort of way. There's a lot of digging, like a lot of digging.
Did they? I assume they had attempted. Did they make an airfield?
I'm not sure. I think so.
They had made an airfield, but Kiska was one of the worst places, and they had better islands, and especially with that too, you don't need it anymore.
Well, then the increasing better ranges of aircraft and
of course
and things with drop tanks and things like that. That's getting better as this is all happening.
Yeah,
like because Dutch Harbor is the main base, right, for all of this.
So
it was an idea to have a kind of like a secondary emergency airstrip.
Well, it was really important because actually something that a lot of people, even the people who know about the Aleutian Islands campaign, don't realize, it was a hypothetical theater to attack Japan.
Right. Technically, yeah. I mean, that had been going on in U.S. planning for.
Yeah, they had pulled the arm of the U.S. Joint Chiefs, and they had confirmed that they thought it could be viable to attack Hokkaido from the Aleutians. Like, it could have happened.
Yeah, that plan had been in place since the 20s, or at least discussions of it.
I would have never have done it because it would have been a logistical nightmare with the
it would have been a huge nightmare. I mean, it was seen as this land bridge, which it is not.
No.
Not even close. Like, this isn't the Hawaiian Islands here. This is Aleutians. They are far apart and they're tiny and they're inhospitable. But yeah, that had been going on for decades within, military circles in the United States. Whenever, they start doing, the War Plan Orange and all that stuff. There's those pushing.
I love the history of war. I like War Plan Orange, its evolution, and how what happens with Douglas MacArthur in the end. That's my favorite conversation.
Yeah. But anyway, that had been going on for a while. And of course, Canada gets dragged into that because that's how these things go. I mean, again, it's very minor, but Canada's still involved in this, and they're still talking because they talk to each other. Militaries talk to each other. And it's a really interesting part, but again, not kind of my area of expertise, but it's just something that is in mind for quite a long time. It's the supposed sort of backdoor kind of land bridge. A lot of terms are thrown around. Obviously, it doesn't end up happening, probably for the best.
There was one, Ian Toll, who's a recent author who did a trilogy on the Pacific. He kind of mentions it a little bit about if the South Pacific campaigns went disastrously,
right?
Perhaps Butler and all of them up north would have eventually got the resources necessary to do something to Hokkaido. But honestly, I couldn't see anything else than bombing campaigns that would have been lackluster.
Yeah.
What are you going to bomb?
There's not
Al
much to
Qaeda is not
bomb.
a primary target at this time. So
No,
yeah,
it's not highly populated. It still isn't.
yeah.
But getting there. But looks like a beautiful place. But
Oh,
yeah, in
it's
terms
yeah,
of
sure.
launching a war, it's not your primary objective. It's not going to knock Japan out
No.
in any way, shape, or form. But anyway, it's just such an interesting whole other area, and there's more scholarship being done on that. I know for sure because my supervisor works on this area.
Oh,
Canada and the Pacific, but he's into the niche stuff, like the tracking boats, like there were spy boats tracking the Japanese in the 20s and all this kind of stuff.
well, there is a lot of niche, interesting stuff. It's hard to find information on like frogman units, certain school. I mean, when you look at in the Pacific, it really comes down to squadrons of pilots doing things all over in Burma and Ceylon.
Yeah.
Like they're everywhere.
Yeah.
But I've never read anything exclusively on the subject. It'd be interesting to have a book just on that as a subject,
Yeah,
encompassing everything.
yeah, there's a lot of little pieces all over the place. That's kind of that's kind of Canada in the Second World War. Is Canadians are everywhere. I like to say that when people are like, "Yeah," I'm like, "Oh, Canadian." They're like, "What?" I'm like, "Yeah, Canadians are everywhere. Not a lot of them, but they're everywhere. They're I mean, everywhere." There's a theater that the Allies are fighting in. There's a Canadian doing something. Anyway, so yeah, so another thing I wanted to talk about why I think, and I said Kiska had the potential to be really, really bad. Not only because of obviously high casualty rates would be really, really bad. That doesn't play well at home, and having a unit that gets bloodied. That they didn't really have any plans for after that. They didn't plan to use that brigade in any other shape or form. However, what also gets missed is a good chunk of that brigade were conscripts. That gets forgotten in all of this. And why that's important is because of, well, if you know any background, Canada and conscription, the First World War, and Canada comes closest to civil war than it had ever had.
Yeah.
Canadians are literally killing Canadians in the streets. That's a whole other thing. But it's got such a huge weighing, again, back to Mackenzie King. It's such a huge weight on him because they send conscripts primarily from Quebec to work, and this is going back to your point about adapting to the Americans, because the Canadians just kind of get slotted in as part of this.
Well, yeah, for the special unit force, they were using American equipment. They had to restructure to American.
Technically, it was all under American command with this for special service force, weapons, everything. But I'm even talking about the the regular infantry.
Yeah, the regular. Yeah.
That were slotted. They were just literally slotted in. They had to change their whole structure. They're taking American structure.
Yeah.
Because in the regimental combat teams, there's no real equivalent in Canada at the time.
Yeah.
So they have to kind of change. So this is where the conscripts come in, because they play the role of the engineers that are within a regimental combat team and how that's organized at the time. So that could have been potentially very bad. Having Canadian conscripts who are not supposed to be technically fighting the enemy, but even though this is North America, technically, there's a bit of wrangling about what that means, and all of that. It has more to do with things like pensions and pay and everything like that. But I think it had the potential to be a massive problem if you're having conscripts getting killed in large numbers, because that's very much was a possibility at Kiska. Even as they're still supposed to be, playing the role of these beach parties. But again, the topography, if that Japanese artillery had been there, that beach would have been a slaughter. So to get these troops in there would have been real bad. And it would have made the other conscription crises later on in the war look like nothing. Crises are minor in comparison to what could have happened at Kiska. So I think that's an important one to remember for Canada and the Pacific, is kind of why there's not much else after that, because it's more or less to show a support to the United States, show kind of the flag, sort of, so to speak, of Canada and in the North Pacific, especially, which is obviously an area of Canadian interest.
Yeah, that certainly made the difference that it was in the North Pacific.
Yeah, because that's exactly why they were okay with it. So, quote unquote, why
you couldn't legitimize there's no way you could legitimize the South Pacific, especially with Australia and New Zealand there. So
no.
Although they're forwarding most of their units to the Middle East and Africa, like there's no tomorrow. But yeah.
And this is again one I haven't done too much digging into. With that's kind of a point of contention between the Australian and Canadian governments. And I think there's a lot going on between those two in animosity. But the Australians are quite upset that Canadians won't even send a token 1 battalion to Australia.
I guess in retrospect, it would be a token one. Yeah, certainly.
It's just kind of, it's in those, in the the history nerd side of digging into the, the documents and some of that, how do I snide diplomatic language. Like you can tell they're upset, but you don't write it that way, but they're upset. So it's really interesting of how it has that definition, or sorry, those impacts and everything like that. And Canadians end up actually going to Australia to teach for radar and radios and communications and things like that. But again, that's a small amount, but Canadians do end up going to Australia, just a small amount. Like I said earlier, they're everywhere. But again, it's usually a small number. So that with back to Kiska and all of that, it's North Pacific is big. Helping clear out North America is obviously has a lot of play at home, has play with the United States, because King has actually quite a fairly cordial and I'd say almost friendship pretty much with Roosevelt, as far as Roosevelt had friends. It's kind of hard to tell with him who was a friend and who he was just really, really nice to. We don't really know with Roosevelt in a lot of cases.
Secret conversations.
Yeah, he was an interesting fellow when it came to that. So unfortunately, he didn't write so much down. But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Very unfortunate for Truman. Who comes into it like, I don't know anything that's going on with these secret agreements you've made.
Yeah, he didn't write anything down, which is, I mean, that was on purpose. But anyway, so King is very much has that in his mind of he wants to work with Roosevelt, because he'd been working with Roosevelt even before the outbreak of war, right, with the Ogdensburg agreements and the joint defense boards and all of that had been going on well before Pearl Harbor. So he always keeps that in mind. How can I do again? Same with Hong Kong. How can I keep everyone happy as much as possible within reason is kind of how King goes about it. But after Kiska, it really, really is very minor for the Canadian Army. Some small groups are sent to China, actually Chinese Canadians are specially trained to basically infiltration tactics, to work with guerrillas, to make contact because of language, and they can blend in, right? They can blend in much easier in what they were trained to do, with dropping in with parachutes and then behind the Japanese lines, again, with the difficulty that is involved in the Chinese theater. It's a really interesting story that's not very well known, but there are some people doing some work on it way more. They know way more than I do, but it does have a place in the Canadian War Museum, so that's important. That story's told. But yeah, there's some really interesting feats and a lot of political wrangling, which is really interesting. But again, I don't know too much, but working with guerrilla groups, right? Everyone's got their own interests that they're working towards, so it's never black and white. So apparently there's a lot of that going on.
Coming off Kiska, because I think it's loosely related. I had to make a point to this because the gentleman who was writing the episodes for the Aleutian Islands campaigns for Kings and Generals, he didn't know about this, but at the beginning, when the Japanese had come in, there was an evacuation of the indigenous populations that were on these islands, the Aleuts. And a lot of people don't know this. Very few of them were actually captured by the Japanese, and they were brought to forget where in Hokkaido. And they had a pretty brutal experience. It always is for everybody in Japan at this time. But the Americans end up quasi-interning them.
Yes.
They bring them over to these specialized camps, and these groups of people had never, they had never seen such trees and stuff, and the psychological effect on them, it actually caused horrible depression. There were some suicides. And not to say that the Americans were outright trying to treat them terribly, but it ended up being a nightmare. And there's a lot of hardship, and it's a very forgotten point of the entire war, because technically these people were quote unquote abused by both sides.
Yeah, I mean they're not treated well. I mean they're not the only ones.
That's why I wanted to bring it up. Yeah, to
both governments, and we'll get there. I guess we'll move there next. But yeah, I mean again, it's because it's such small numbers and it's so inaccessible, and like that's another part of this. Because another story here from my supervisor, because he's actually been to this place. Like he's like it's something out of like Jurassic Park or something. He's expecting like a dinosaur to come out of these long grassy quasi plains. You don't even know what to call any of these geological features because they're so contained. It's a mountain next to a plain. Anyway, it's I can't think of a worse place to go.
No, it is rough. It is certainly rough.
It is bad. Anyway, so he was telling me stories about there was some possibilities that the Japanese were actually executing some of the indigenous people. So that is difficult to because they've been buried there. So it's difficult
I've never read anything about it. Actually, that you bring it
Yeah.
up. I have never read anything about that. I've only read about the few that were captured because the Japanese they didn't have a lot of time to actually capture most of these people because all the other islands, the Americans had actually swung in pretty quick to grab them.
Yes. Yeah.
And not that the Japanese were going to go grab them or anything, but
No.
it wouldn't surprise me the Japanese would do
Yeah, I
atrocities.
mean that's the thing, right? Because it's been so long ago now, and those populations don't live on Kiska anymore because nobody
Yeah.
lives there anymore. Probably best for everyone. It's just you don't know, right? It's just there's this talk of it happening, but again, with the Japanese brutality, it's not out of the realm of possibility. Anyway, so yeah, so speaking of moving along with
Internments.
internments in Canada, so
And just
another
to
thing,
note, because obviously, since this is on YouTube, the majority of my audience are American. So, yes, Canada does intern the Japanese, quote unquote, basically on par with exactly what America did. And we kind of followed America's example in a lot of ways.
kinda, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Canada, in the good and the horrible, it has its own tinge when it copies people. So you have again more myths. It's said to be done because the Americans asked for it. They didn't. Canada did it all. Was happily very happy to do so.
Oh, there was a history, especially in BC, of
Oh
just
yeah,
horrifying riots and terrible things
yeah,
because of really angry railroad workers that attacked Japanese prop. It was terrible for years.
yeah. And there's all kinds of exclusionary laws in BC, and
Yeah, this was just an excuse to really let it all just let loose.
pretty much, and the federal government goes along with it
Oh yeah.
because they're at war, and they don't really have no reason to say no in that sense. I mean, it's they set up what's called an exclusion zone, which is west of the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah, keep them away from the coast was
Pretty
basically
much
what
to
they were
keep them as
doing.
far away from the coast as possible. So everyone is more or less rounded up. Um, kind of again, this is all just so relative and how this goes because it takes quite a while. It doesn't happen overnight.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of show up at this park, bring stuff with you, and you're leaving.
Yeah.
And it happens piecemeal. They were also given the option to leave. You said you can leave now if you can get a job, say east of the mountains, say on a farm somewhere in Alberta or Manitoba, which a huge number do, and actually end up settling in those places, which is, I think, very interesting for the post-war and how the demographics change in some of these places with people of Japanese ancestry. And
Toronto is the big story, I find.
Yeah, well, even where I'm from London, Ontario, and the very small, I'm sure it's growing now, but the Japanese population comes from internment. Anyway, so yeah, so they gave them the option. If you can find work, you can go. If not, we're going to put you in. They call them camps, but they're not like what's in the United States.
Yeah,
there is a difference there. Again, I'm not saying this is better because it's not. They're not better. Like they're not barbed wire. They're not guard towers. There's none of that going on. Like they're ramshackle camps that they've just basically thrown together, or old abandoned mining towns. They basically just cram them all together and say, this is all you get. Because their homes, their businesses,
their boats,
like fishing boats,
the boats go
cars,
first, yeah,
luxury goods, stocks of stores. Like I did a story. I worked with Project 44, and we did a whole tracked a whole family. Like they confiscated all the goods that these guys had been in. This family and another family, it was two families working together, that they had imported from Japan for a very long time. They just take everything, and they never see any of it again. And they get pennies. I mean, pennies on the dollar. People say pennies on the dollar. This was pennies on the dollar.
I think the grossest thing is the pennies that they get, they end up having to spend while they're interned to survive. Yes. Basically, they have to buy things.
They have to pay for their own internment, more or less.
That's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, and then and again, like they're given jobs, so to speak. People move around. People have health issues because it's a different climate that they're not used to. Because most of them had been living their whole lives, in the coastal areas of British Columbia, and then they're moving them to these dry. Again, no hate on Alberta, but it's just different weather.
A lot of them. A lot of them are fishermen, and their trade is stolen from them. They can't go to the coast because it's a designated dangerous area because of
they've been completely excluded from the West Coast. If anyone's within the West Coast, they'll be arrested and removed. And this even goes to the Supreme Court of Canada and gets upheld. It's just a giant mess and a very much black stain on Canadian history. I think was done.
The worst part about it is people will be surprised to find out when it technically ends.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
later than World War II.
Much later.
Yeah.
It's again, it's the same way as how it's set up. It's
Yeah.
slow.
It's slow. Yeah. Yeah.
It's doesn't take humans into account. Humanity is stripped.
And the idea of the deportation after the war, a
Yeah,
lot of
and
these
some
people had never been to the home
nope.
country. So
Yeah, and they're given the choice. You can go back, you can stay where you can go back to your British Columbia, which a large number do not go back.
no, they go east.
They go east, and the one family we tracked, yeah, they end up in Hamilton. And they've set their roots there, and they've been there ever since. Some go, yeah, Alberta, Manitoba, some even make their way out to the East Coast, which I think is really cool. Because again, I love when Canadian stuff gets mixed around.
That is kind of funny. They go from the west to the east coast.
Yeah, I know, right? It's a very small number, but it's really interesting, and I just love it when Canadian culture and other cultures mix together. And then also, I loved all the food, so that's why I get excited.
Certainly, honestly, it's
it made Canada better.
Yeah, it helped culinary stuff.
Yeah, it made Canada better. I mean, it's awful how it had to happen, but it made Canada better by people moving, which it didn't have to happen that way. Yeah, so it has a massive impact. It takes a long time to undo all these things. I mean, people kind of just sort of melt away after a while because they have no money either, so you can't really go anywhere. Again, they're not being held by barbed wire fences or anything. Just they can't go anywhere because they can't go anywhere. You're in the middle of nowhere. You're in the BC interior, or you're in Alberta.
It's kind of a Canadian situation. Yeah.
There's nowhere to go. You can't just go down the road because that road couldn't go for 4 days.
It was it Jasper? Where was the Jasper, Alberta, or there was anyway, sorry, there was a camp that was really isolated
so there's
somewhere.
Camps well, yeah, a good chunk of the national parks are actually made by intern labor, which again is slightly different as well. And I think that's an important distinction to make here is there are enemy, as it's called, termed enemy aliens who are interned in these whatever amounts to a prisoner of war camp. That is different, but some people do get thrown in there from who have been technically they were civilians, and even Canadian citizens get thrown.
Well, if you're suspected, I guess, of
they cause problems. Yeah. If you cause problems, they throw you in one of those camps. But yeah, so kind of going back to that, at the end of the war is over. They're given the choice: you can go back wherever you want, or you will pay for you to go back to Japan. And some were not given the option; they were just straight out forced to go back. Some were Canadian citizens and were forced to go back. Some chose to go back because they didn't want to deal with this ever again. And some of them had never been to Japan, right? Some of them only spoke broken Japanese. And they shoved them on these boats, send them across the Pacific, and then they end up in Japan.
Probably Hokkaido too.
And this country is destroyed. And I kind of lost the trail after that, but it's I can only imagine the more suffering that results from that policy, which was just, again, awful. And we still feel the legacy of that one today.
Well, I guess to bring upon the issue of the legacy, it was Brian Mulroney made the official apology, I believe, because Reagan, I think Ronald Reagan had to do something similar at the time when they apologized for it.
And they gave payments to anyone affected. Huge. Yeah, it was massive. Again, but it's still, it has, like we were talking about, reverberations for people moving, families moving to different places, and still, the scars of being treated that way is not just going to go away after a generation. Yeah,
and so I think a lot of Canadians are actually pretty aware of the situation because, David Suzuki, for example, is a famous example of someone who came out of this, and a big speaker about everything. For the United States, it'd be George Takei, I guess.
George Takei is probably the best known in the United States. I mean, there's been fictional characters that were, given internment stories. But yeah, David Suzuki is the biggest Canadian example. He's a scientist, environmentalist, activist, does all kinds of things, and he's still going. He just stopped doing TV, and he's in his 80s. I mean, good for him. It's incredible. Another guy from London, I gotta rep my London, Ontario people. There's not many of us. But yeah, so it's just so. This is how it is well known. I mean, some people are upset about it for all kinds of other reasons. Racism plays a key role for some people when they won't admit it.
I don't want to go down the foxhole that is what starts with the railroads. I mean, a lot of people understand that, there was these exclusionary acts. There was the Chinese head tax back in the day in 1885. But for the Japanese, it's special because there was a thing that they called the Gentleman's Agreement, which was this really kind of nasty thing where the Japanese government just secretly had an agreement with Canada and the United States about stopping immigration.
Yeah, they stopped the immigration. Yeah,
But
so it's
then, yeah, when the United States tried to really be firm on their stance, they started to come up here more, and we kind of
yeah,
played political football with that. And
yeah,
a lot of riots happened in BC, and a lot of Japanese owned properties and Chinese owned properties. So the Chinese were thrown into this too, of course.
yeah. It gets all
Terrible
thrown
things
together.
happened. And this is
I mean, yeah,
before World War II.
yeah. This is all. I mean, some people are doing work on this, and it needs an overall like hard study. Like someone needs to really look at this in terms of this. But yeah, it's another stain on Canada of
Yeah.
throwing these people into these ramshackle abandoned mining towns or camps that they have to literally sometimes scrape a living or an existence, and it takes forever to finish this and get people to places where they can exist again as humans, and it's
Yeah.
just
For the audience, it officially ends in 49.
technically.
It's a long time.
Yeah, the exclusion zone is removed technically at that time.
Yeah.
No one was still technically interned. Again, this is the word that's used, even though it's not
Well,
technically what's going on.
it's because you can't escape, especially because it always gets mashed up with the United States and what happened. So, and with the
Yeah.
United States, there's a very different situation because the guy who was in charge of a lot of the internment camps really, really was malicious. Like,
Oh god. Yeah,
out of his
and
way.
Canada. It was not saying it's good in Canada, but it wasn't to that level in that
Yeah.
way. But
Yeah.
so that's a part of the Pacific War, and why I wanted to come back to that too with Hong Kong is because garrison is almost like 99.999% casualties, right? Most are captured. So there's concern in Canada. If we treat the Japanese people of Japanese ancestry this way, what are they going to do to our boys in the Hong Kong POW camps?
Yep.
So that does get talked about in the higher echelons of government. Clearly, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't stop it from happening.
Well, they probably, they probably took a cue from the Australians because the Australians had a very similar circumstance. A midget submarine attack happened on Sydney Harbor, and they ended up having some of the bodies captured from the midget subs from the Japanese, and the Australians did ship them back and gave them full military honors and everything because they thought it might help with the New Guinea campaign to just lessen the atrocities. Yeah, the Japanese gave them a pretty rough no to that.
It didn't lead to better treatment for. I mean, nobody does anything. The treatment of the Hong Kong POWs is terrible. Yeah. Just like the majority of POWs, and again, most of them taken by the Japanese is just awful. And it's discussed, particularly early on, but it doesn't really lead to anything. Fortunately for anybody, there's no better treatment meted out for any of it. So it's an unfortunate part. And again, another, people don't think it's as bad as it sounds, and it is as bad as it sounds. These people had their lives stripped from them for no reason. A good number of them are, like we said, and this is important, they were Canadian citizens, Canadian born, bred.
Never seen the home islands.
Never been to Japan. Some of them would go and learn Japanese on Saturdays, like they would spoke English. So it's a really sad, unfortunate story. But yeah, so that's kind of what's going on the home front. It's pretty much contained to those areas we talked about. So moving along in the war, right? Canada's getting heavily involved in Italy, starting in 43. Obviously, the D-Day landings is where the majority of the Canadian Army effort.
Europe first, yep.
Yeah, and then North Atlantic and the bombing campaign in Europe. So throughout this time, like I said, the RCAF is involved. Squadrons are, like you said, are overseas. There's transport squadrons. Flying missions. They even fly over the infamous hump to bring supplies to the nationalist Chinese. Canadian squadrons are involved in that and do that for the entire war. Unfortunately, one of the RCAF planes goes down, and they don't find it again for decades. And the War Museum did a great display with that and everything, and talking about those stories. So they finally were found and given proper burials and all of that. So that was good. Another connection is obviously Navy. There's naval aviators serving mostly, obviously, with the Royal Navy. Canada doesn't have any aircraft carriers at this point. Get them later, and then they disappear. But at this point, they don't have any. So they're serving with the Royal Navy. So Hampton Gray is who I mentioned earlier. Robert Hampton Gray wins the Victoria Cross for taking out a Japanese destroyer on the 15th. 14th of August, just before the surrender happens. He attacks it, and it's a posthumous Victoria Cross. So that's kind of the last one. I think it's the last Victoria Cross awarded to a Canadian ever, actually. There has been one since. Yeah, that's part of it. And the story that I'm sure some people know and are waiting for is one of the strangest stories. There's no way to put this. HCMS Uganda. A misname. It's sometimes erroneously called a mutiny. Technically, it's not, but it sounds fun and it sounds cool. And I've had multiple people say to me, "Are you really a Navy if you hadn't had a mutiny or two?" Because Canada doesn't really have any. So it's not technically a mutiny, but it's called the ship that votes itself out of the war. And that is 100% accurate. So just to back up a little bit. So once the war in Europe is wrapped up, or starting to wrap up, the policy that's put in place in Canada is that the troops that will go to the Pacific will be volunteer only. We're not going to send conscripts like we had to do after things got really bad, say after the Battle of the Scheld and all of that. We're not sending any conscripts. We're not going to send whole units. That's not going to happen. Like, we're not just going to, pick up and throw, the Chaudière or the North Shores into the Pacific. That's not going to happen. You have to specifically volunteer and say, yes, I want to go. And actually, a bunch of guys in Europe figure this out, that they're going to get to go home first and hope that the war ends. And they were right. And they were very lucky that it did, because
I'll bring it up at the end. Yeah, very lucky.
They were getting ready to go. They were training and getting ready, but some of them figured it out. They got lucky. But so that's the policy. It's on the individual to volunteer. It's not units. It's not squadrons. It's not even ships. Yeah. Each individual, has to say, I will go. So Uganda is sent to the Pacific before all of this happens. They're augmenting the British forces that are in the area. They famously take part in the Okinawa campaign. They're part of the anti-aircraft screen and all of that, and part of the bombardments of a couple other islands.
That sucks. To be part of that in Okinawa.
Yeah, I mean, they're lucky they don't take any casualties because they're pretty far out. But they're part of that campaign. That's where they go, because they go to Australia first and then work their way up. So this policy reaches them. They take a vote. They literally vote on the boat. Yeah, that sounds funny. Vote on the boat, and in the majority say, no, I do not want to serve in the Pacific. The commanders on the boat have no idea what to do.
Yeah.
They didn't think they'd say no. So they thought they would just continue as normal. They had to, call back to Canada saying that they said no. We took a vote and the majority said no. So they're left in place for a little while. The Brits have to get another boat to take the role of Uganda in the force, because we know the war with Japan is still going on. It takes some time, takes a couple of weeks for this to happen. So they're eventually replaced and they leave. They turn around and head for Pearl Harbor. And from what I've heard, the reception at Pearl Harbor was a frosty one.
I would imagine it would not go well.
Not happy that they were there. They were not expecting them to be there. They're like, you're the only one, because this is it, right? This is the only one that Canada sends to fight in that part of the war. Jeez. So they get the very, very frosty reception at Pearl Harbor. I mean, there was, again, it's all hearsay at this point, and people said, oh, my relative told me this. Some claim that the Americans at first said, we're not going to give you anything. You get no supplies. Good luck. I don't know if that's true. I mean, it probably isn't. I mean, it makes for a good story. But yeah. I mean, again, it would have been a real frosty reception. So this is around July in 1945. So what's kind of not an irony and kind of funny is the atomic bombs are dropped, which is not funny. Obviously, it's awful. But that's what brings the war to the end. Uganda's not back yet when that happens. The war is over. Uganda still hasn't made it back to Canada yet. They get the news after coming out of Pearl Harbor and steaming to the West Coast that the war is over. So they did this all seemingly for naught, because as we know, after Okinawa, the home islands just get bombarded. I mean, yes, there's still casualties, and that's war, but they avoid this sort of end of the war for seemingly no reason. And it's taken on this tint to it because they vote themselves out, and this name now is tarnished. they literally changed the name to HCMS Quebec in the post-war period.
Of
They
course,
don't
it's
even
Quebec.
keep it as Uganda because it was originally a British boat. It was HCMS Uganda. So they just kept the name. But after that happens, they changed the name. Like, people aren't going to know
Yeah,
which ship that is. It's just another bumble after a bumble. It's such a Canadian way of doing this. We'll fix this PR problem, and actually we'll end up creating a much bigger one.
pretty bad PR,
So,
especially to come at the end of the war. That's pretty bad. Yeah,
and I mean, it's the only real contribution in that size by the Royal Canadian Navy. Obviously, their hands are extremely full in Europe. I'm not denying that, but it's a support, and they fight. And I'm not saying they don't fight, because they fight, but they vote themselves out, all for not to even make it home before the war is even over. I mean, obviously they don't know there's atomic bombs, but it just adds to the comical thing. And then the government says, hey, let's change the name. That'll make everyone forget. And no one has forgotten what happened. It's just, it's so funny that it gets called a mutiny in quotation marks, because it's hilarious in that way. And it's a mess for a long time after that. And commanders were not happy, and higher ups were not happy. And it just turns into a whole internal fight, basically, in the Royal Canadian Navy for a little while. And it goes away, obviously, because everyone's happy the war is over. So it doesn't really amount to much, but other than a name change. But the ship stays in the Royal Canadian Navy, just as a different name for quite a few years after that.
it actually makes for a pretty good segue that you're bringing up, the end of the war, because I don't think many people would know this, but the infamous what if Operation Downfall had occurred,
Yeah.
it was going to involve Canadians.
Yes. So there was, going back to what we were talking about, right? That individual policy of you have to volunteer. You have to basically re-enlist.
Volunteer for the worst and bloodiest war that anyone is hearing about from U.S. Marines and Army people. Yeah, I can imagine there was a lot of volunteers for this.
Yeah, well, there was actually a huge number, because a lot of them figured out, hey, I can go home, because they got home leave first. They got about a month of home leave. So that is, I mean,
that would work out in your favor.
If you've been in Britain, if you've been in Britain and Europe since 1939, right, that's going to look pretty good. I mean, that was pretty rare that Canadians got that kind of leave, right? You can't just jump across the channel and go home. That doesn't exist. So they jumped on that opportunity. But yeah, so the Canadians are training to go to the Pacific. A bomber group is put together. The Army is training to do this. They have to re-equip and use some of those already set up regiments that have set up battalions that are on home defense.
Yeah, I can actually explain this to the audience. So Operation Coronet was going to be the invasion of Honshu and Kanto. So what would have happened, because this is all on paper, it's pretty interesting. There was a hypothetical thing that was going to be called the Commonwealth Corps. It was actually proposed from Mountbatten. Or actually, was it Mountbatten? No, it was Allenbrook. Is it Allen? I don't know.
I can't remember.
I think it was Allenbrook, and it would have been one Australian, one British, one Canadian division, and 2 brigades of New Zealanders, I think. But hilariously enough, the guy that haunts every episode I do, General Douglas MacArthur, he had a little involvement in this, because there was a proposal to have an Indian Army division, but he said no because of language differences, organization structure, and such.
Of course.
Anyway,
you want to talk about
him. Emperor Douglas MacArthur gets his way.
I could talk about him for 6 hours if you want.
Yeah.
Anyway, not a big fan. Anyway, yeah. So Canadian division is getting trained to come over. I mean, it's obviously going to be a different war. Taking as many lessons as they can. Obviously, as close coordination as they can have with the Americans. But again, it's so not last minute, because that's not the right term, but the war in Europe is over. It's a different conflict. It's a whole different set of circumstances at home
that they haven't trained for. Yeah,
they're not trained for this. Canada doesn't have the capability to get a huge number of troops across the Pacific. I mean, getting the Hong Kong POWs out of there was difficult enough.
Yeah,
getting them back was difficult enough, and because the only certain amount of ships there, armed merchant cruisers, were kind of over there. Actually, the one that they were sent on, actually came and got a few number of them out of Hong Kong, which is a kind of a bookend to all of that. But yeah, Canada is not equipped to fight in the Pacific in that way. I mean, they're going to need help, as we did in other areas, but mainly in the Pacific. to be fall into the American kind of sphere of doing things.
Yeah.
So again, it's all hypothetical. Who knows how it would have gone, how it would have worked together, how this, the Commonwealth would have fit together, how they would have worked together. I mean, we get to see that in Korea, and it works out very well.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah, that is what probably would have looked like. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it would have been way bloodier. I don't think anyone's going to dispute that.
Yeah.
But maybe it would have been the same. I don't know. We don't know. But and many people in Canada can being alive to that not happening, just like lots of others.
Oh yeah.
Canada's not immune. Canada's the same with that. I hear lots of Americans be like, yeah, grandfather was going over the Pacific. A lot of people in Canada too, and veterans, right? And veterans from Europe. So it's just one of those big, what ifs. A relief for a lot of people here in North America and throughout the world. That it doesn't happen. I mean, obviously, it's a horrific ending to a war, but a lot of people in Canada were extremely happy that it went that way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a great way to finish this off. This is this hypothetical, Gotterdamerung situation in which the Canadians would have had to throw themselves into that situation, which was averted, which is great. But I was interested to see the kind of inner plans of that. They even had I had the title somewhere in my notes. There was a force that was made kind of at the end, the Canadian Army Pacific Force.
Yes,
which kind of fits into this. So it was going to adopt American organization, the equipment and everything, because probably American ships would be moving the guys anyways.
Exactly. Yeah, that was the plan. Yeah, so it was to fall into the American. That's why I said like sphere. It's probably the best way to say it. Yeah. Because the Americans had the logistics down in the Pacific for a long time at that point. So
yeah, they're the ones who they had to figure it out, and like amphibious assaults. The Americans are the ones who really learned that.
Exactly, and I mean, and it quote unquote worked in Kiska, right? They used American weapons, American organization, all that stuff. It quote unquote again worked without combat, but. It was going to be the same similar idea. And one thing I didn't mention before, though, is that there were Canadians over there, officers learning, just like they had done in North Africa, to learn from the Americans of what this was going to be like, reading and learning and being embedded and all that stuff.
And there was, even with the famous British 14th Army in Burma, they did have Canadian officers. I can't remember how many of them with them. So in some of the hottest places in this war, there were Canadian officers who were getting hands-on experience with.
Yeah, they wanted to get that jungle experience working in those different climates, which Canada does not have. So it's not like you can do that at home. People in Hawaii were training, all that kind of stuff. So that goes on. It's just, it doesn't really go anywhere.
Nope. But they were preparing. They were
preparing. Which is also interesting, and maybe this could be a good place to end, and kind of going back to Hong Kong where we started, is, again, we talked about that volunteer basis for all of this. So actually, for those who volunteered, they were going to get more money to go fight in the Pacific. That was also another draw. It was called Pacific Pay. You get more pay. So they were given that pay as soon as they had their leave and joined the training in the West Coast, basically. For that, and that's was a big draw. Get more money. Kids growing up during the Depression, more money is going to be a big factor. So what's interesting is obviously that doesn't happen. It doesn't go through. So what that leaves is an issue in the post-war world for Canada. Is you had Canadians fighting in the Pacific already. They didn't get extra pay. They were also POWs for almost 4 years.
Oh yeah,
that leads to a big fight in the House of Commons. And again, it's just part of my dissertation, and it's not a conspiracy theorist, but when things start to line up, it's a little weird. So even the Canadians who fought at Hong Kong were initially denied the right to wear the Pacific Star. They're outright said, you're not allowed to wear it. You've suffered horribly, and some of you didn't come home from the POW camps. You saw your friends die, and you don't even get to wear this star, and let alone we're not going to give you the extra pay. So it turns into a huge fight in the House of Commons in the post-war world, and like the immediate time. This is how we're going to treat our veterans, kind of thing. So eventually they are given that pay. They're given the extra pay. But again, we talked about last time in Hong Kong and afterwards, and that's just kind of the start of these Hong Kong veterans and what they face over the last, whatever it is now, decades. And unfortunately, there's only one left. We have one Canadian left who fought at Hong Kong, and he's years old. So we have one left, and so that's the legacy. In my opinion, it's not a good legacy, but it connects to, it's a bookend in a way, because it starts Canada's in the Pacific and sort of ends it in a real another negative tone. So again, it's a small involvement, but there's a lot of negativity, a lot of mishandling, a lot of ball dropping, a lot of not good, a lot of poor decisions, and a lot
which
of
fits the Pacific.
Yeah, it seems to be on par with everybody else, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just it's one of those things that we don't, because we don't talk about the Pacific that much in Canada, period. I mean, generally speaking, we don't look to the Pacific. We look still to the Atlantic and down south.
And if it's ever talked
anyway,
about,
so,
just Hong Kong.
Yeah, so it's just it's still it's still a thing, and it still has an impact. And but there was Canadians in the Pacific, I guess, as if you remember anything, there was Canadians there, and all three of the services, and doing amazing things. You get a Victoria Cross for one of them. So technically two Victoria Crosses in this one, starting it and one ending it. So I think that's another good bookend too, is there are these feats that are worth remembering in that level, because they're both posthumous Victoria Crosses. So
excellent. And before you go, if you could actually just let everybody know where they can find your stuff, because you happen to be a fellow YouTuber.
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel. It's called OTD Military History, where I do primarily Canadian. I like to get the Canadian story out there, sometimes a little sneakily. I kind of like to, not necessarily a bait and switch, but kind of try to cover as much as I can, or the things I know. I'm actually, in a previous academic life, I was actually an American historian. So I try to bring that in when I can, actually working on Pearl Harbor. So it's a really, it kind of came full circle for me. So I cover things like Canada in the First World War, Second World War stuff, done things on War of 1812. Obviously, Hong Kong gets a good chunk of my attention for obvious reasons. But yeah, I'm also on social media, and it's a bit of a different name. It's OTD Canadian Military History throughout other social media branches, on Twitter and Instagram and pretty much everywhere else, Facebook, all that good stuff. So I appreciate checking it out, and try to cover these sometimes also world events from taking a Canadian sort of perspective, or bringing something new to some of these well-known events, and trying to bring a different lens to it.
Awesome. So you heard that, everybody, please check him out. And again, thank you so much for coming back.
No, thanks for having me. It's always great to talk about the Pacific. Again, like I said, it was previous life. That's what I did. That's where I started. So it's always great to talk about it.
Awesome. All right, everyone. This has been the Pacific War Channel. Over and out.